Welcome to Magnet's November edition of our Media Justice Salon, hosted by the Media Action Grassroots Network, entitled Towards Decarceration, Can Media and Technology Challenge the Status Quo? Media Justice Salons are interactive webinars that highlight top-line media and communication policy issues that are hosted for network members and our invited allies. They are a great education opportunity for members to learn more about critical media issues, to connect with leaders in the field, and to find out how to take action at the local and national level. We're really glad everybody has joined us today. We hope you're ready to hear from three amazing guests who will share their expertise on mass incarceration issues and the role that media and tech can play. My co-host for today's salon is Gabriela with Voices for Racial Justice. Gabriela, thank you so much for joining me today. Would you like to share a little bit more about yourself and Voices for Racial Justice?
Hi, Angela. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here today. Like you said, my name is Gabriela Marquez. I'm the Youth Organizing Director at Voices for Racial Justice. Our work here is really focused on building power with communities of color and allies through training, organizing, and research and policy. Our campaigns at the moment are centered on parks equity, education equity, person and media justice. The youth organizing work at Voices is incorporating organizing training for youth of color, which is embedding arts and culture in organizing curriculum, a youth organizing network that carries out agenda building leading to action, as well as a youth advisory council that serves as a type of board to hold our organizing accountable to the youth we work with. So really our youth organizing work is centered on making sure that youth of color have their voices at the center, and we're opening spaces for them to be leading and to be, for us to be learning from them as well, not just teaching them.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. We're really excited to have you all join us. You know, you all have been a fantastic anchor member of ours, so we appreciate Voices being with us today. For those who may not know me, I'm Angela Belota with the Media Action Grassroots Network. We're also known as Magnet, and we are a project of the Center for Media Justice. As the membership organizer, I lead the network's education and peer exchange convenings, as well as space-building efforts to grow our membership. So we're always looking to connect with like-minded organizations, so please feel free to reach out to me to learn more about the network. Magnet represents over 150 social justice, media, and art and culture organizations from all around the country. Together, we're working to advance a people-centered media justice agenda, promoting communication rights, media and technology access, and fair representation. As a national network, we work to amplify local grassroots voices to influence media policy debates. Before we begin, I would like to share a few logistics about the actual webinar. We will be recording today's session, and it will be featured on the front page of the Magnet website in the next few weeks. We are hoping that folks will join us on a parallel Twitter conversation online. So for today's call, we're asking folks to use the hashtag #MediaJustice. For the time being, all of our attendees will be on mute. Once we hear from our three presenters, we'll open up the call for you to ask questions. In order to ask a question, you should make sure to look at your right-hand side on your screen. On your control panel, you'll click on the red arrow, and then use the chat section on your panel to submit a question. We do know that we have some folks joining us just by phone, and so for those of you who are joining by phone, please feel free to email your question to Shiloh at shilo@mediajustice.org. To begin, we do want to share a little bit of background about what this webinar is going to be about today, and really to have a general sense of how is it that technology and media will be impacting this critical historical pivot in mass incarceration. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Gabriela.
Thanks, Angela. First, let's talk a little bit about the historical context for this conversation. In the wake of civil rights movement successes, the Republican Party saw an opportunity to draw white conservatives into the party, uniting around the criminalization of Black and brown people. This political maneuver, united with corporate interests, ushered in 4 decades of intensive prison building. Each generation has seen its version of race-based oppression, from slavery to the least convict system to lynching, Jim Crow laws, And now we're living in an era of the new Jim Crow, which is fueled by a drug war that has resulted in over 2 million people behind bars in the U.S., where we're locking up more of our own people than any other country in the world. Thanks to years of organizing, the tides are starting to turn, and we've seen a recent bipartisan push for decarceration, including the recent release of 6,000 people from federal prison. Conservatives want to shrink big government and shift the economic burden of punishment to families. Progressives want to address the racial and economic inequalities that fuel incarceration and rethink the punishment paradigm. In the face of this bipartisan attention on decarceration, we ask, will technology and media advance the status quo or challenge it? What should we be doing differently to ensure effective and people-centered solutions are being implemented for the success of our returning citizens and residents? On today's webinar, we're going to be looking into the role of media and media representation as well, and the impact that it has on policy efforts. We'll also examine what the push for decarceration means for returning citizens. We'll scrutinize quick fixes like electronic monitoring to see if they are substituting for or extending incarceration, and what policies are needed to ensure the rights of the monitored. In joining this conversation, we hope you'll be able to see the power we as organizers and advocates have in helping to shape the narrative and policy direction of decarceration to ensure we maintain a people-centered framework when addressing mass incarceration. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Angela to introduce our speakers.
Great, thank you. So I'll share a little bit more about our speakers, and then we'll move on over to the first presentation. So Alan Jenkins is Executive Director of the Opportunity Agenda, a communications, research, and policy organization dedicated to building the national will to expand opportunity in America. Before joining the Opportunity Agenda, Alan was Director of Human Rights at the Ford Foundation. He has worked for the U.S. Department of Justice and for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, where he defended the rights of low-income communities facing exploitation and discrimination. Next, we have James Kilgore, who is a writer, educator, and activist based in Urbana, Illinois. He helped stop Champaign County's jail expansion and is an international expert on electronic monitoring, putting out a recent report on the issue published by Center for Media Justice. The report is based on 4 years of research and interviews, as well as his own experience of being on an ankle bracelet as a condition of his parole. James recently published Understanding Mass Incarceration, a People's Guide to the Key Civil Rights Struggle of Our Time. Finally, we have Tara Liebert. Tara is the co-founder and executive director of Free Minds Book Club and Writing Workshop, an award-winning organization based out of Washington, D.C. Free Minds uses books, creative writing, and peer support to awaken youth incarcerated in the adult criminal justice system to their own potential. As a radio and television news and documentary producer for 12 years, Tara was drawn to direct service after producing numerous features on the U.S. criminal justice system. Tara has trained at the Freedom Writers Foundation Teachers Institute, and her writing has been included in Teaching Hope, Stories from the Freedom Writer Teachers. We're really excited to have everybody with us today. So let's go ahead and dig into the conversation by having our first presenter, Alan. Alan, can you kick us off by telling us a little bit more about the Opportunity Agenda?
I sure can, and thank you, Angela, Gabriela, and Shiloh, and thanks to Magnet for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I really think it couldn't be happening at a more important time. If you can jump one slide ahead. Great, thanks. So for folks on the call who are not familiar with us, the Opportunity Agenda is a social justice communication lab. So we use communications and culture to build public support for greater and more equal opportunity and human rights. And reform and improvement of our criminal justice system is a key part of our agenda. Next slide, please. We have a lot of resources for and developed with advocates and faith leaders and labor and progressive business leaders and public policy folks and many others on how to communicate more effectively on issues of criminal justice reform, racial justice, immigration, and economic justice, looking at cultural trends, media trends. We try to respond quickly when something good or bad happens as a news hook for us to tell our story and frame the debate. So I hope folks who are on the call will check us out at opportunityagenda.org and sign up to get on our list. Follow us on Twitter at OpAgenda. Next slide. So we talked a little bit, you heard a little bit about the importance of the moment that we're in. Criminal justice reform is in the public discourse, and my own view, for a number of reasons that you'll hear, is that we really have the opportunity for transformative change, not just tinkering around the edges, but really creating a new system that reflects our highest values, that is equitable, focused on true public safety. Public support and the national will is crucial to achieving that. And what we see, those of us who study public attitudes, is that really right now the U.S. public, the vast majority of folks are carrying around at least two competing stories in their heads when it comes to our criminal justice system and where we should be headed with it. If you can click on that slide. So the first story is very familiar to folks on this call, and it really was the dominant narrative of the late 20th century. It's about punishment, about so-called individual responsibility. In other words, don't do the crime if you can't do the time, and the idea that incarceration is the solution to most problems. It's us versus them, meaning that it both embeds a lot of racial and other stereotypes, but also sets people who have committed a crime apart as both separate and unequal to the larger society. And it's rooted not only in stereotypes, but a lot of fear of the other, fear of crime, legitimate fears about violence, but often directed towards the wrong solution. But at the same time, if you can click again, there is a competing and much more positive and useful story that the vast majority of Americans are simultaneously carrying around in their heads. And that's a story rooted in the idea of prevention and pragmatism, the notion that we should try to address the root causes of crime and violence rather than dealing with problems on the back end with incarceration and policing. It's rooted in ideas of opportunities, that people should have a chance to start over after missteps or misfortune, what many people call redemption. And the idea of accountability, which as those of you on this call know, is different from retribution and punishment. In other words, the notion that people should be held accountable if and when they harm others, but that's different from essentially revenge or retribution. Next slide. This one's actually out of order, but hopefully you all are familiar, many of you, with our social justice superhero, Helvetica Bold. You can find her on YouTube. I'm going to skip over this slide because I want to get straight to the content. There we go. So this comes from the Opportunity Agenda's public opinion research, a survey, large national survey that we did in 2014. And it shows one of the ways in which people are carrying around multiple stories. So this is when asked the question, is society better served by harsher punishment for people convicted of crimes or by a greater effort to rehabilitate people convicted of crimes? You see a slight majority in 2014 said harsher punishment. So when the question was framed in that way, the public was largely split, but a small majority said harsher punishment. Next slide. But when the question is framed differently, should more money and effort go towards attacking the social and economic problems that lead to crime through better education or job training, or should more money and effort go towards crime by improving law enforcement, more prisons, police, and judges? You see that the public overwhelmingly supports dealing with social and economic problems. In other words, prevention by expanding opportunity. And so, this really speaks to the notion that the way in which we talk about reform, the way in which we invoke particular values and narrative in the public discourse really have an important effect. And you see that the point at which there was almost close to roughly equal support for so-called deterring crime on the one hand and attacking social problems on the other was in the mid-90s during the Newt Gingrich era and the era in which President Bill Clinton was promoting the crime bill and harsh retributive policies. Next slide. This is just one more indication of the way in which people are carrying around multiple stories. So when people are asked, should we invest in alternative sentencing programs, and as James will note, there are a lot of different definitions of that. And here we asked about alternatives to sentencing, to criminal sentencing and incarceration. For people convicted of nonviolent offenses, we asked, should funding of those programs be increased, held the same, or decreased? And so you see here at the top that about half of all Americans say we should increase resources for alternatives to incarceration, whereas 43% said we should hold resources the same. Only 9% said that we should reduce our investment in those strategies. And you see that many other demographic groups, the support is actually even higher, or at least slightly higher. So again, people are carrying around a couple of different stories in their heads, importantly, and the story that we trigger in the way we frame this debate, in the way we organize and pursue advocacy, is going to be very important. And that then leads to the media stories that are told and how we can affect them. Next slide. Final piece of public opinion research. This is about reentry issues and policies that I know many of you on this call are working on. And you'll see that there's significant support for some types of reentry. The public is more or less split on some other kinds, such as ban the box. I think support has increased slightly since this poll was taken, due in part to the advocacy that many of you on this call have done. But you see again that people are open to it, but it's by no means a slam dunk. Next slide. And then there's this. This is a rare moment of bipartisan support for some types of criminal justice reform. Not all by any means, but there is an alignment of conservative ideologies and progressive ideologies on this issue. And so I think, unlike almost every other social issue out there, there is a moment for some bipartisan reform at the federal as well as state and local levels. Next slide. So then there's the media. We at the Opportunity Agenda are continually studying media trends and narratives, both in popular culture and in the news media. And what we see will not surprise anyone. When it comes to coverage of crime, not of criminal justice reform, but of crime, the vast majority of media undermines support for reform and perpetuates stereotypes. Those are stereotypes based on race and ethnicity and nationality and immigration status, and also frequently the stereotypes around people emerging from prison and jail. And that is not a new phenomenon, but it is a continuing phenomenon. And we see more recently the rise of harsh immigration policies and detention issues merging in some with traditional domestic policing and incarceration policies. So in many ways, popular culture and news media on crime are not our friends. You think about the local news, despite the fact that crime rates are at historic lows, the lowest they've been in decades, and yet the local news in almost every metropolitan area is filled with stories of crime and mayhem. That, of course, influences public attitudes. Next slide. At the Opportunity Agenda, we have had the opportunity to study in a deeper way media depictions of Black men and boys. And so the stereotypes embedded in media are by no means limited to that one group. But we did have the opportunity to study depictions of that group. And what we found probably won't surprise folks on this call, that African-American males are overly associated in the media with crime, with violence, with poverty, unsolvable problems, and overwhelmingly depicted as takers rather than contributors, problem solvers, parents, teachers, and the like. And when I say overly associated, I mean far in excess of the actual involvement statistically of African American men and boys in crime, violence, poverty, and the like. And I have no doubt that if we were to study depictions of some of the other demographic groups in communities of color and low-income folks, we would find similar, though somewhat different trends because the stereotypes tend to differ. Next slide. Something that many of you have seen is that visuals matter. So these are from social media, but this was reporting by NBC News on the police killing of Mike Brown, unarmed teenager. The image on the left was the original image that NBC News used, and after Black Twitter and protests, they began to use a more representative picture on the right. But we see this pattern over and over again of specifically with victims of police violence, but often in other contexts involving violence and people of color, that often the images that are selected by mainstream media deepen stereotypes about violence and crime and the like, and also, of course, diminish public support for reform and change and accountability. Next slide. So now that you're thoroughly depressed, I can say that there is also some very good news, which is that when it comes to media coverage of criminal justice, as opposed to crime, coverage of the system, that coverage mostly supports reform. We see that, and we looked here at mainstream news media, we looked at social media, and we have in the past looked at ethnic media, as well as more informally at cultural trends. We see that pro-reform voices greatly outnumber anti-reform voices across all media. In other words, those of us who are pushing for a more just and equitable criminal and restorative criminal justice system, and for alternatives like treatment and rehabilitation and restorative justice and the like, our voices are much louder in the media than those of our opponents. We see that prisons are overwhelmingly framed as broken institutions, and typically in ways that are supportive of the story that we want to tell, of that set of stories that Americans are carrying around that are about the importance of rehabilitation and opportunity and prevention. We did find that the main narratives around reform, criminal justice reform, tend to be more about cost savings in the mainstream media than about values or human rights, although in specific to policing, we do see a rise of values and human rights discourse. We see that there is coverage of solutions and alternatives to incarceration and reentry programs, but those are typically incremental, by which we mean kind of small bore solutions rather than what most of us would consider to be transformative approaches that really re-envision what are not just our criminal justice system, but how we treat mental health issues, how we treat issues of drug use and drug addiction. And we see that although criminal justice reform advocates, many of us participating on this call, have a lot of airtime and a lot of ink. In other words, we're quoted more than our opponents on the other side, but we have tended to lack a shared core narrative. So whereas the opponents of reform have a very tight story about law and order, about limited resources, about fear of violence and crime, and often demonization of people who have committed crimes, advocates for reform have tended to have a much more diffuse set of messages, some effective, some not. Many struggle to talk about issues of racial inequality and immigration and violence in particular. And so, as you'll see in our recommendations, that's going to be something that we believe we need to tighten up on. Next slide. Social media, too, is often a platform for change. And this was true even when we did our study in 2013 and 2014, predating the Black Lives Matter movement on social media. We see that pro-reform voices are the loudest, meaning they have the widest reach, that there is a lot of not just communication, but activism for change, as we have seen with Black Lives Matter and Say Her Name and other efforts. But there is, again, inadequate discussion of systemic causes and solutions. And the voices of formerly incarcerated folks themselves are too often missing from the discourse. They have too little opportunity to tell their own story as opposed to the story being told about them. Next slide. This is just a slide to show this public opinion showing that communications matter. The bottom of this slide is cut off, but this is a question asked in 2 years, 2013 and then again at the end of 2014, about whether African Americans receive equal treatment as whites in the criminal justice system. And you see that different demographic groups answer the question differently, but you see that everyone over the course of that tumultuous year and a half was significantly more likely to find unequal justice at the end of 2014 than they were at the beginning of 2013. And look at millennials, labeled as young adults here. They were at 40% likelihood of saying unequal justice, much less likely than the average American. By the end of 2014, they're at 63% saying that they find bias. So significantly more than the average American at 56%. So we need to remember that millennials are, most subject to change. They're on a steep learning curve. They are much more likely to know people of a different racial or ethnic group than their elders, and therefore they're getting much more diverse information, and they're much more attuned to social media, and therefore a particularly important audience for communications and change strategies. Next slide. So our recommendations, and excuse me, all of these are stated in much greater detail in our reports on our website, opportunityagenda.org, and we will also make this PowerPoint slide deck available to anyone who wants it. Media activism, I'm going to gloss over because I think everyone on this call, you're all media activists, but it could not be more important at this moment to push back against negative media depictions, inaccurate media depictions, perpetuation of stereotypes. The mainstream media's business model is crumbling, and they are panicked, and they are looking for new stories to tell, and this is an important moment, especially important moment, for us to push them to do the right thing and reward them when they do. Media production. This is the first moment in human history in which we all have the ability, at least all of us on this call, have the ability to reach millions of people around the world and to hear back from them. And so we need to more and more be media producers to tell our own story, to produce our own images and narratives. And this is the moment where we have the tools to do that. The next recommendation is a shared narrative, and I touched on that, the fact that we have tended not to be telling a common story. Now, this does not mean that we should all be saying the same thing. This is not the idea that we should have just a common soundbite or message, but rather that the larger story that we tell should be rooted in a set of values that correspond to that set of values around opportunity and second chances and equal justice. It should be rooted in those shared values. We should be highlighting the systemic obstacles to equal justice and to reentry and return into our society, as well as the ways in which we should be really focused on keeping all communities safe, and that true alternatives to incarceration are the most effective way of doing that. Solutions. We saw again and again in our research that there is inadequate coverage and discussion of solutions and true alternatives, and we need to lift those up. Some of you have heard me say that there's a reason why Martin Luther King Jr.'s greatest speech was not called "I Have a Complaint," and yet often we jump straight to our complaint and don't lift up solutions. And a call to action. We should never be engaging with an audience without asking them to do something, even if it's to talk to 5 friends about the problem and the solutions, because that's the most persuasive communication, is what comes from friends and colleagues. And then finally, lifting up the voices of formerly incarcerated people, helping them to tell their own story, because their voices have been too much absent from the debate. And that means that it's very easy to caricature them and to tell a story that is not accurate. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to end there, except to say, please do check out our website, opportunityagenda.org. Please do follow us at OpAgenda. Opportunity1 is my handle. And I look forward to the question and answer period at the end. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Alan. I feel like there's just so much information. We're going to have to invite you back to educate us some more. I think a lot of what you shared today, like you were saying, really hits home with a lot of the work that our folks are doing. And it's so critical to always integrate that communications piece in any of our campaigns and our advocacy efforts. So now we'll go ahead and transition us over to James Kilgore from Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center, who's going to share with us some more about electronic monitoring. So James, thank you so much for joining us. Go ahead and take it away.
Oh, thank you very much, Angela and Gabriela and Charlotte for organizing this and for including me in the session. Looking forward to interacting with everyone on the call. You can flip. Next slide. Okay. So maybe just to back up a little bit and follow up on what Alan was saying in terms of the moment that we're at right now, I've put the point here that decarceration is trending. That is that a lot of people are talking about it, as he pointed out, from Rand Paul to Cory Booker and so forth. And there's something kind of ingrained in North American culture about looking for a quick fix, technologically based solution. And I think an electronic monitor is one part of that search for a quick fix solution. I mean, an electronic monitor, I just want to do a little basics on what a monitor is. I was on a GPS monitor for a year, and a GPS monitor tracks your every move, and it's recorded, and your parole agent or parole officer can see where you are, and also they can be programmed with exclusion zones and so forth, so you can't go to certain parts of town, or you can be subject to violation, subject to even incarceration if you go to these exclusion zones. There's another kind of electronic monitoring which is called radio frequency, which is typically applied with just a curfew, and that is it only says whether or not you're at a given place at home or not, and it usually means you are free to go during the day, and you might be subject to curfew at night, say from 9 to 6 or 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Whereas with GPS, typically you have to request from your parole agent, you have to request a movement each and every time you leave the house to go anywhere. And you might have to put all your movements, you might have to give them to that parole agent or probation officer a week or 2 weeks ahead of time, every time you plan to leave the house. So I'll come back to some of the problems with that later on. But another reason why electronic monitoring is being promoted as an alternative to incarceration is that it saves money. That is, it's cheaper to have somebody on an electronic monitor. The estimates vary, but $15, $20 a day for somebody to be on an electronic monitor, maybe 80 or 100, even $150 a day to have somebody incarcerated. So, and because of the enormous faith that people have in technology, it's somewhat easy to sell electronic monitors as a measure of public safety. That is, as long as we know where people are, somehow we should be able to control them. So if we look at the 6,000 people who have recently been released from the feds, I think somewhere around a third or 40% of them have been released to house arrest on an electronic monitor. Next slide, please. Now, my view is that those people have not been freed. Another 30% of those people are in halfway houses, which is also not being released from prison. Halfway houses are a form of incarceration. They're not, you're doing time when you're in a halfway house. Now, in most instances, when you're on an electronic monitor, you are not being given credit for time served. And my argument is that an alternative to incarceration should be something that's used instead of incarceration. That is, you are on an electronic monitor as part of fulfilling your sentence, rather than electronic monitors being an additional condition of something like parole, probation, or pretrial release. And I'll discuss that a little bit more as we move forward. But I would also argue that an alternative to incarceration must embody a different mindset, a different ethos, that it should not involve the punishment paradigm, this punitive mentality that has penetrated virtually all of our criminal justice system, but even many of our other public institutions, such as education, such as mental health, and so forth. We've seen the spread of a sort of punitive mentality. In my mind, if we're going to develop an alternative to incarceration, it must be an alternative to the mentality that incarcerates, the punishment paradigm. We must begin to look at some of the things that Alan talked about, second chances, about what Brian Stephen talks about, mercy. We must be thinking about social justice and equality, not punishment. And if we're not applying those kinds of ideas to regimes of electronic monitoring, then I don't think it qualifies as an alternative. And part of that is that it must respect the rights of the individuals who are on the monitor. Next slide, please. So here, this is some of the common uses of electronic monitors. So a big use is that people on parole are given an electronic monitor, a GPS, increasingly a GPS monitor. Some people on probation are given GPS monitors, and a lot of people who are released before, as they call it, pre-trial, before their case has been resolved. It might be as a condition of bail. It might be as a condition of a release without bail, own recognizance situation. But this is not an alternative to incarceration. This is a condition of a situation in which people are already under the control of the state, already under the control of the criminal justice system. So it's not being used instead of incarceration, but in addition to another form of control, which is not supposed to be incarceration. It's also used for youth who are involved in truancy cases, increasingly for immigrants awaiting hearings of their case. And we've seen recently that many of the children and mothers who have come from Central America and been stuck on the border, the tens of thousands of people last year who were stuck on the border, many of them have now been released on electronic monitors. A particular target for electronic monitoring is people with sex offenses histories, and they're the ones that most often get exclusion zones. They're typically banned from going near parks, going near schools, going near daycare centers, going near anywhere children are likely to be, even if their offense has nothing to do with children. And in at least 9 states, certain categories of people with sex categories with certain people with certain categories of sex offenses have GPS monitoring for life. And then we do see electronic monitors used in a situation which I would call an alternative to incarceration. That is, they are used as a sentence for minor offenses, especially for driving under the influence. And then there's a different kind of use that they're put to in domestic violence cases, where someone who is a potential perpetrator of domestic violence, he's put on a monitor which keeps him, which triggers an alarm if he or she comes within a certain perimeter of someone who is likely to be a victim. So that's a slightly different use than any of the others, and perhaps a use that has a little bit more legitimacy than some of the others, which seem to be simply an additional constraint on an already difficult situation for people. Next slide. So, as I've said, my argument is that electronic monitoring should be considered an alternative form of incarceration, not an alternative to incarceration. So I think that's very important. The debate on this has not really looked very seriously at what electronic monitoring actually does. It deprives people of their liberty. When it's combined with house arrest, it's liberty deprivation, and liberty deprivation is the basic definition of incarceration. So somehow this thing has become this vague kind of technological device that hangs on people's ankles, and somehow it seems as if they're free to move around, but in actual fact, they're under very strict control, particularly when they're on parole. If they're on an electronic monitor, their movements are extremely limited, and they're quite often, it's difficult for them to seek work, very difficult to participate in family activities, to participate in religious activities, to respond to medical emergencies, and so forth. Next slide, please. So the reason that this is not an alternative is, as I mentioned, it's typically implemented with house arrest, which means deprivation of liberty. And as long as there's a fundamental deprivation of liberty, it's not an alternative to incarceration. It's an alternative form of incarceration. And it's typically implemented in a punitive way. That is, the parole agent has virtually absolute decision-making power on whether or not a person can leave the house or not leave the house. And in most cases, and I've looked at a lot of contracts for electronic monitoring, I've looked at a lot of information, I've interviewed a lot of people who have been on electronic monitoring, and it's virtually without clear guidelines as to how it should be implemented, what a person is and isn't able to do when they're on electronic monitoring. It's completely left up to the whim of a parole agent or a probation officer. And on top of that, another dimension of the punitiveness of electronic monitoring is the fact that it typically comes with user fees. So people are paying in the realm of $10 to $15, $20 a day to be on an electronic monitor. So it's accumulating debt, which becomes another vehicle by which people can be sent back to prison. So you can easily be violated on electronic monitor, not only by not paying your fees, but if you may be given a time release to go to work from 8 o'clock to 4 o'clock. If you're on public transportation, your bus is late, you come back at 4:15, you can be sent back to prison for that kind of violation. There have been many instances where people's devices report them not being home when they are home. There's a whole series of cases of this in Wisconsin where people went back to jail and prison because their device didn't work properly and register their location. So if you respond to a medical emergency without permission, you can be sent back to prison. I've interviewed people who have gone to the hospital when they're bleeding, they need stitches. They end up meeting the police when they get at the hospital and doing time in jail because they weren't able to get permission from their parole officer to carry out that movement. So the ultimate point about this is that there are no specified rights for the monitored, for people who are on electronic monitors. That is, when you're in prison, you have entitlements and rights. They're limited, and they're often violated, but they exist and they form the basis for appeal. You may have the right to a certain number of hours of recreation per week. You have the right to access to legal research materials. You have the right to visits. You have the right to a certain number of calories of food. In some of the places where I was incarcerated, it even specified how many pairs of boxer shorts and socks you were entitled to. But there are no rights for people on electronic monitoring. None whatsoever in almost all the jurisdictions that I've seen. It hasn't been scrutinized as a form of incarceration, and it hasn't been regulated the way in which other forms of incarceration are. Next slide, please. So my reflections on electronic monitoring and some of the recommendations. First, I believe that people should get credit for time served when they're on electronic monitoring, particularly in pretrial situations, and that at the moment it's just an additional time that they're spent under deprivation of liberty. That needs to be reversed. It's very rarely been looked at by people who are actually using this in the courts. Secondly, I think there needs to be a list of rights and entitlements for people on electronic monitoring, and I'll outline those in the next slide. Third is that electronic monitoring should not have user fees. People should not be paying a daily fee to be incarcerated. It should definitely not come with cost recovery, because that becomes a burden on the families. We're shifting the burden, the financial burden of incarceration from the state onto the families where the people who are on the bracelet are living. And lastly, with GPS, we have a great accumulation of data about the location of where people travel. If you're on electronic monitoring for a year, every place you've gone in a year is in a database somewhere. And there are no regulations about how this is used or who has access to it. In the European Union, they have an extensive network of regulations about this. In Germany, all GPS tracking data has to be destroyed after 2 months. In the US, the companies that make money off of this, and by the way, one of the big players in electronic monitoring is the GEO Group, the second biggest private prison company. These companies brag on their websites that they keep this data for at least 7 years. And for people who deal with questions of big data, this is getting combined with a whole lot of other databases to add to people's individual profile. Last slide. And next slide. So I'm advocating that we should begin a dialogue about the rights of the monitored. I went to that conference in Europe on electronic monitoring and human rights in 2014. Those are two phrases that are never uttered together in the United States. But my argument is that if someone is on an electronic monitor, they should have the right to seek and maintain employment. They should have the right to access education, medical and mental health treatment, and religious activities. They should be able to participate in family and community activities. They should be able to carry out required survival tasks. The conditions of some people's electronic monitoring regime says that they're allowed to do shopping or laundry if there's no one else in the house that's available to do it, shifting that burden of labor onto family members. They have the right to be treated with dignity and respect, not to be left at the whim of a parole agent in terms of whether they're able to carry out certain kinds of activities. And lastly, that they have the right to have the personal location tracking data remain private and eventually deleted. So my argument is that we should begin that electronic monitoring is going to become a more popular tool of decarceration, and we should make sure that it's used that it's seen as an alternative to actually being locked up, and that when it is implemented, we see it implemented with a different kind of approach than the punishment paradigm that's dominated prisons and jails. I mean, I would argue that we need to change the paradigm inside prisons and jails, but we definitely need to be changing it when we're looking at alternatives to incarceration, and now is the time to do that. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, James. Thanks for this crucial conversation, and really digging into some of the complexities that we sometimes miss in this work, but really need to be at the center of it. There's been a lot of great coverage on your recent book, Mass Incarceration, A People's Guide to the Key Civil Rights Struggles of Our Time, and your insight on electronic monitoring and ways to move towards people-centered policies is critically needed right now. Next up, we want to transition to the ways these criminal justice policies and technologies play a role in youth incarceration. Tara Liebert from Free Minds Book Club and Writing Workshops will be talking to us now about the impact of criminal justice policies and technologies on youth returning home and then being placed on probation. Tara, congratulations on your recent Library of Congress Best Practices Award. We're excited to learn more. We're so excited to learn about your freelance and the young. Sorry, it seems to be delayed.
So no worries. Thank you so much for. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you, Alan and James. Those report outs are really interesting. I learned a lot, and I'm really excited to share. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll get to the meat of our story. First, when you were saying about the Library of Congress, that I think is a huge sea change, and the fact that we did actually win an award in literacy for our program with incarcerated youth. We do book clubs and writing workshops inside was a really big shift, and that the Library of Congress even recognized the populations that we work with, and they purposely came and told us that. So I see it every day, this exciting trend toward more people being aware of the epidemic that we have and what can we do to solve it. So just to sum our program up, for about 13 years, we've been providing, as I said, a book club, just like a regular book club that you would think of, and a creative writing workshop to youth that are incarcerated as adults. So they're in the DC jail. They're 16 or 17 when they're charged. And because we're not a state, we have a unique situation in that we all our members go to federal prisons instead of, even though they're, local charges, they're in federal prison. So we have a continuum of services. After, when they turn 18, they go to federal prison. And right now, we are in touch with members in 66 federal prisons all across the country. And then when they come home, we provide intensive reentry support with the job readiness and personal skill building apprenticeship, and a violence prevention outreach, where our members use their personal stories of success and share their experience in the criminal justice system to reach other youth and prevent anyone else from entering it. And what you said, Alan, about the voice of those affected by the system is sorely, sorely lacking. And that's what we at our organization realize and work super hard to get those voices out there. Me and Kelly Taylor, our co-founder, started this because we did a documentary about a young boy on death row in Texas, Glenn McGinnis, and in covering his story recognized the critical lack of services for youth in the adult prisons, but also as journalists, the critical lack of these voices. And so we just produced a book of poetry and success stories of our members' home called The Untold Story of the Real Me. And that's our biggest message, is that there is the courts, the social workers, the probation officers all have a story about these young men, but no one ever listens to their own story. So that's what we work really hard to get out. You can go to the next slide. We've worked for about probably 13 years altogether, probably 8 years with reentry, and we've learned a lot. We recognized that there were very few effective quality programming in the city, and so we basically had to do our own. That's pretty much what we do. We're lucky in that we're a small organization that can be very flexible, and we try things out, and we test them, and then if they, we change them, and really are responsive to the needs of our members. And because our members were so young when they were first incarcerated, and the average sentence is about 7 years, these are all felony crimes, usually armed robbery, and they have particular needs that we work really hard. And in one way, in terms of the technology with reentry, they are cut off, right? So they have not, most were disconnected from school in the first place, and so we're not, and their schools were under-resourced, so they didn't even have the advantages of computers in the school, learning all that technology. And then you go to prison, which is completely a black hole because no internet, all the things that you wonderful advocates already know. And then they come home, and that learning curve is so steep. But because they are young and adaptable, they really catch on quick, like with the smartphones are a huge asset. But we find ourselves, we have to do a lot of computer training with typing, with, every time you apply for a job, it's online. I mean, it's really changing so fast. And I feel like the reentry support world is not prepared, and we're not keeping up fast enough in creative ways to do that. You go to the next slide. So the good, the bad, and the ugly. The technology is the good is that, once again, the smartphones and the apps and the ability for them to access resources so quickly and information by learning the internet is amazing. The social media, you can connect with people right away. We use it. The bad is social media. You can connect, and not realizing with Facebook and the Instagram that everyone can watch, and that law enforcement, your probation officer, and everyone is watching very, very closely and not being aware how you are tracked. The ugly, the GPS, electronic monitoring. Most of our members, it's when they're home, and it's at the discretion of the probation officer to put them on the ankle bracelet. And basically what we find is too many are assessed as high risk right away and put on it as a way to really cover their responsibilities as a probation officer. If something should happen and the youth was identified as high risk, and they just said, okay, I'm going to do the GPS. We also find that it's not effective in terms of rehabilitation, because they'll say if you're violating some condition of release, then you get, the ankle bracelet put on you. It always it leads to more sanctions. And our member, the youth is on it, is never, it just shuts them down, and the relationship between them and the probation officer deteriorates, and it's very hard to recover. As with everything, it's all personal relationships. If you have a really caring probation officer that uses it and explains it, it can be they put on and then a reward that they did really well on it, and then they can move up. But if not, I've seen it all used too indiscriminately and not enough communication about it. And we just have to remember that probation is law enforcement. It is not, I have not seen its outlook is rehabilitative. So that's a challenge there. And we go to the next slide. We have been asked many times to be the voice of those affected by the system, which is great, but I find that we speak, and oftentimes the organizations don't really understand the experience or don't take it into account when they're making policy recommendations. And what I find is there'll be a legislative, whether it's DC City Council or the federal Congress, and they'll put a whole law package together, and then they'll go to us and say, hey, what do you think? Instead of asking first what is working, what is not working, but that requires a lot of effort and time and detail when I feel like they just want to, get it done and have it look good. And if you really pull it apart, you'll notice some of the downsides of it. And I think that's, I know I want to keep us on the time. I don't know if I have another slide. Do I have another slide? I think that might be it. Oh, one size does not fit all. That's what we find in working with 1,000 youth. They say, oh, all youth charged adults need this. All probation needs this. And it's like in anything, right? A large organization in terms of either the prison system, the probation system, tends to just group everyone together to make easy, cost-effective, low cost, not cost-effective solutions. And that is absolutely not the case. And why we have been so successful is our ability to do individual reentry support, individual case management. We follow our members from when they're 16 to now, oh my gosh, they're turning 30. And we really get to know them on an individual basis. And so that's what my call to action and to all of you as advocates is to do that really hard work to find someone who's been affected by the system and really work with them to prepare them for the media. As I say, as a former producer, that was my job for many, many years. And I find it so incredibly important for them to be aware and to not just say, oh, okay, tell your story. There has to be a lot of media training. And I think that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tara. I think, it's so important. I think all of you have, given us some great bits of information around what policymakers should really be thinking about, and especially you, Tara, making sure that folks are thinking of those most impacted, right? And our young people and our families who, are coming and returning back to our communities. It's really critical to keep them at the table, and we know that they are actually the experts. So this, I think, is a really great time for all of us to, one, take a breather and to open it up for questions. We have been receiving some questions through email. A reminder to folks, it looks like folks who have called in are sending emails to Shiloh, so please continue to do that. Her email address is shilo@mediajustice.org. And then for those of us who are with on the panel, please remember to just open up your chat box option and enter your question there or a comment, and we'll make sure to share it with our panelists. So while we gather some questions, I'm going to pass it to Gabriela. It looks like she has one for Alan. So Gabriela, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks, Angela. So Alan, what would you say are your top 3 suggestions for messaging the need for rehabilitation and an investment in reentry support?
Well, I think, the number one approach that we recommend is, structuring all of our messages and our narratives in terms of values, problem, solution, and action. And so, the leading with the values you share with your audience. So if it's an audience that already agrees with us, it's our base, we want to activate them. We may be talking about, justice and reuniting families and the like. If it's a more conservative audience, just barely persuadable, we might be leading with prevention and common sense and pragmatism. But, we want to eventually get to, the importance of the values of opportunity and a second chance. I think in terms of the problem, again, I think we should be talking about the obstacles that, let's focus on reentry for a moment, that people are really facing. And I think, James gave us some great examples of how, some electronic, technology approaches that seem like they, give people liberty and, freedom to start over actually don't. And so, we need to be talking about those obstacles, about the discrimination that people face coming out of prison, about the kind of often arbitrary policies that prevent them from practicing the trade that they may have even learned in prison. and then, really focusing on that solution in action so that we're immediately pivoting to the story of how things could be better and what we're for, not just what we're against. So, that value, problem, solution, action, understanding your audience, making sure that we're highlighting what people are for and what they can do to make a difference.
Great, thank you so much, Alan. It looks like we have a question for James. James's question is from Donald. Do people elect to go on electronic monitoring, hence the user fees?
No, people don't elect to go on electronic monitoring. How that decision is made varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I mean, states, counties, they have their own electronic monitoring programs. So, for example, in Illinois, where I was on an electronic monitor, the parole officer can decide whether or not you should be on an electronic monitor as a condition of your parole. Typically, it's put on by a judge. So it might be a condition of parole, it might be a condition of pretrial release. Sometimes they'll say, well, you can go out on your own recognizance, or we'll give you bail, but the condition of that bail is that you must be on a monitor. So for example, myself, I was released from prison in California, but my family was in Illinois. I wanted to be with my family in Illinois, so the condition for me to be paroled to Illinois was that I agreed to be on an electronic monitor. But it's not something you volunteer for. It gets imposed on you one way or another. And maybe I can just say one other thing. I'm also not saying that at an individual level that electronic monitoring is not better than incarceration. Of course it is. Of course it is. But there's a difference between what we may recommend for an individual, given the limited options available, and what we think of in terms of policy when we're in a period where we're trying to conceptualize alternatives. So I'm certainly not condemning anyone for going on a monitor or saying that it's worse than being locked up. But I think when we think in a policy sense, we have to think beyond what works for an individual in their particular situation.
Okay, so we have a question.
Go ahead, Gabriela.
We have a question. No, you're good. We have a question from Barbara for James. To whom can we address those good demands about electronic monitoring? Legislatures, carceral authorities, county boards, where? Who should we be targeting?
Well, I mean, electronic monitoring is being used in all kinds of jurisdictions. So, in effect, we could be engaging at every level. I think, as with most things in the criminal justice system, a lot of debate gets framed by what happens at the federal level. So, for example, I think right now it would be very useful to look at what's happened to those 6,000 people who've gotten released. Look at the people there who are on electronic monitoring and see the ways in which it inhibits them actually being free. And that would seem to me to be an entry point. But we're really talking about reframing the issue. I don't think there's many places that are ready to change the status of electronic monitoring and acknowledge that it's a form of virtual incarceration. I think we have to have that debate and push it at different levels, at the state level and at the federal level. I mean, those are the places where the real policy gets made. We need to be engaging people at those levels. But the fact that we're talking about decarceration and alternatives now means that the door is open to this, but it's very important. I mean, Alan talks about having everyone with a similar message. And so far, even people who are opposed to mass incarceration, who are pushing alternatives to incarceration, haven't really reflected seriously on electronic monitoring and what it really is. So that might be the starting point, like what we're doing on this call, and then work out to find pockets of legislators that might be receptive to a different vision of this.
Great, that's great, James. Thank you so much. It looks like we have a question from Chris for Tara. Tara, what have been successful strategies that you have advocated for to convince probation officers to dig deeper and to actually connect with the young people who are on probation?
I think because we know our members so well, we have a huge advantage in that we can tell them everything that's going on. One of our main learning lessons that we do at the apprenticeship is communication, and we say having a successful relationship with your probation manager, because we find that our members are doing great things, they're working, whatever, but because they've been so beaten down by the criminal justice system, they're not going to share things with law enforcement of, you know, good or bad. They're just not going to say anything. So we can provide that piece where, did you know they're doing this? Did you know they're doing that? And usually they'll say, oh, no, we had no idea. So the fact that we're a third party who is, you know, vouching for them is huge. And once again, it's the individual probation officer. If we find that they're just not workable, we just go up the system. We go to the supervisor, and we're lucky that we have enough credibility within the system as an organization that we're a trusted partner, so they know if we go up. We also now are doing reading, writing, and reentry workshops with youth on probation. So we went to them and said, let us help you out. So we provide that for free. So we also have a lot of leverage that way. But once again, it's all personal relationship, finding out what benefits them. The probation officer is so usually, you know, overworked, doesn't have enough time. So if you can make it really easy for them, write a letter, you know, whatever work, you know, write a letter to their supervisor, how they, you know, released one of our members early from the GPS and understood, then that's going to make them look good, and then they're going to want to work with you.
Thank you so much. So I have a question for Alan. Do you see the current public narrative shifting in any way to support strategies for decarceration or to harm those efforts?
Well, I think overall the narrative and the public discourse is shifting in a positive way, a way that makes really transformative reform more likely, especially regarding true alternatives to mass incarceration and more effective ways of welcoming formerly incarcerated folks and helping them to reintegrate and participate in families, communities, and the economy. Overall, I mean, I think it could easily, you know, turn the other way. I think, you know, crime has been going down for the most part for the last 30 years, and it took a long time for people's perception, people's fear of crime to catch up with the reality of historically low crime rates. But I think that's a positive trend that is really affecting people's openness and reducing people's fear. And one of the reasons why you see even many conservatives starting to change their attitude. The crazy costs associated with our system of incarceration are persuading some people who might otherwise not share the value of reform. I think, as I noted, demographic change, and you know, we have a rising electorate that is both more diverse and more fluent, culturally fluent, and so they're more likely to hear from people different from themselves, and I think that's helping. But, you know, things could easily swing back in the other direction if crime rates go back up, or if, you know, kind of the counter narrative makes a rebound. I think we could easily see that openness turning in the other direction. And so that's why it's so important for us to communicate effectively, for us to increase both the quality and the quantity of our communications and our advocacy on this. And again, to push for really transformative change. I mean, to ask the kind of tough questions that James notes about, you know, not just kind of adopting what looks like an easy fix, but rather thinking about, okay, how could we have a system that really is focused on keeping all communities safe and ensuring equal justice? And you know, I think it's within our reach but it will not happen on its own.
It looks like we have another question for James. James, with the 4 years of research that you've done, it looks like Cindy is wondering, are there states that advocates should look to that may have policies or attempts at policies that would consider the rights of those being monitored?
I wish I could say that there was. In actual fact, there really isn't any state that I could say has a policy that really respects the rights of people. The only state policy that I've seen that even vaguely specifies some entitlements for people on electronic monitoring is Michigan, which says people should be able to get should be able to work and then seek medical treatment, but there's certainly not any attempt to change the ethos in which electronic monitoring is applied. And I will say that the state of Michigan charges $17 a day for people to be on electronic monitoring, which is pretty punitive in and of itself. But the other states that I've looked at, and I've looked at all the states that really have significant numbers of people, at least on parole, do not have any kind of specified entitlements. It's all left up to the individual. It's really, I mean, it also reflects the way in which parole itself is framed, because parole itself is often not very well regulated and left up to the whim of parole agents in terms of how it's implemented. So it's part of the whole kind of mindset, which I mean, Alan talks quite a lot about the mindset change that we need. We need to be people who are parole officers used to be thought of as social workers. Now they're self-images that of police. So we need to engage that kind of mentality. The only place you'll find informative alternatives on electronic monitoring is in Europe. There's a whole set of recommendations that the European Union has developed around human rights and electronic monitoring. And one of the most amazing ones includes that an electronic monitoring regime should not impose unnecessary inconveniences on the people that live with the person on the monitor, which is almost unthinkable in the United States. So I would recommend people, I can post a link to that, to the set of recommendations that the European Union has developed on this, if people are interested in having a look at that. And I've drawn on that quite a lot in the report that I wrote, Electronic Monitoring is Not the Answer.
Could I add one thing to that too? With our members, if they are found, in terms of the whole mentality of law enforcement, if they're found tampering with their GPS, then they get hit with tampering with a government device, which is a really harsh punitive, because our members are under federal probation, even though it's local offenses. So it's really, once you get on that, and then it's very hard to get off in terms of our members that are on probation.
I mean, and that's right. And in several states, it's a felony escape offense to tamper with a device. So even though, and there's an irony there, because it's not considered a form of incarceration, but yet you can be charged with escaping from something that's not a prison.
Thank you. So I want to take this to all three panelists. What are some of the upcoming projects or campaigns that we can be getting engaged in to stay connected to these issues?
Well, I can start. Sure, thanks. I mean, I think the most accessible one, that we're connected to is Ban the Box, which, probably most folks on this call know what that is, but it's essentially removing the question that is often asked in employment application forms about prior convictions, and considering that only much later in the process, if at all, once it's determined whether somebody is overall qualified or not. And so there's been a lot of success there. I think many of you saw in the slide I provided earlier that the public is of two minds and somewhat divided about the question, but it's it's really advancing, and it's something that creates significantly greater opportunity for people coming out of prison or jail, or often who have even very old criminal records that have been holding them back. It's it's not a magic wand or a silver bullet. It's not going to fix the whole problem, but I think it's one thing that where we're seeing significant progress and people can be a part of, and including again folks who are themselves formerly incarcerated who could tell their own story about the opportunity they need to fully participate.
Also, just to add the personal side of it, when our members are on it and they're working in their jobs, there is such a stigma that you have that ankle bracelet, and they have such shame around it that it's really hindered them being successful on the jobs, whether it malfunctions, they have to leave, they have to keep it charged, people know, oftentimes maybe we find an employer that will hire them that doesn't tell the rest of the coworkers of their, their past, and it really just, in all ways, it adds to more stress and does not promote the successful reintegration. That's what we have found.
James, did you want to chime in on that question? Okay, we may have lost James, but it does look like we have a question. Gabriela, this one's for you. It looks like folks are really intrigued by your introduction, and we're hoping you could share a little bit more about what Voices for Racial Justice has been doing in engaging young people on criminal justice efforts.
That's a great question, and that's actually something that we're just at the beginning of. This summer we launched our youth cultural organizing training, which was for youth of color, high school youth of color here in the Twin Cities, and it centered arts and culture. So we just recognizing the importance of having a platform to express themselves creatively and do that movement building work. Criminal justice is something that's very close to the youth that we work with, to their hearts and their realities, and that's an area that they want to be connected more to, and something that we're trying to see how we can help youth to be building and carrying out their own organizing around that. We certainly have youth locally engaged around Black Lives Matter. We just in the last couple of days are communities in crisis responding to the assassination of an unarmed Black man in North Minneapolis. So a lot of the youth are engaged in those actions and in that organizing. I mean, I can speak a little bit more. I don't know, Angela, if you're going to ask me a question more specifically around our criminal justice work, or I can go into that now.
I think it would be great if you shared a little bit more about what you all are doing at Lino Lake.
Sure.
Since we have so many criminal justice folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a partnership with the Lino Lakes Correctional Facility, and this partnership is called Bridge, and it came out of a relationship that our executive director was building with a group of young men incarcerated at Lino Lakes who wanted to be more connected with the community. And so as organizers, we started kind of trying to see how can we be building these bridges between those that are incarcerated and that are trying to organize inside of Lino Lakes, and then the advocates and organizers on the outside that also want to be lifting up the narratives of incarcerated folks and do it in an intentional and strategic way. So, we get the privilege of working with some incredible organizers that are currently incarcerated. We've collaborated with them on a few convenings that bring together community advocates, artists, organizers, politicians, even to Lino Lake, where they could connect and build with, but also learn from the stories of the men that are there. We've been working together around prison phone justice and have been able to elevate some really powerful narratives through Magnet, actually. We're able to take one of our partners' sons, Kevin Reese III, to Washington to advocate on behalf of his father as well. So, you know, most of our staff are actively involved in our bridge work at Vinyl Lakes and provide organizing mentorship and coaching for key leaders in the bridge partnership that are inside of Vinyl Lakes to kind of build their own organizing capacity. But right now, what we're trying to do is be more intentional in including their family in this process. So we're going to be holding a convening in December that's the first that we've done in this way, where we're centering the voices of families with incarcerated loved ones. It's going to include people from Vinyl Lakes, but also others. And so we're just trying to solidify these connections and these bridges within Vinyl Lakes and then in the community. We have a lot of youth that are very captivated and very interested in criminal justice work, that have been deeply impacted by the criminal justice system and are looking right now for ways to create a youth strategy connected to this work.
That's great, and I feel like there are, oh, go ahead, Tara, please.
Oh, no, I was just going to chime in. I think that's amazing. I love that partnership, and something I neglected to mention is that's one of our big goals is to connect the inside and the outside. So we do a program called Write Nights where we have the poetry and writing of our incarcerated members they mail it to us, and then we gather community volunteers and they provide feedback on the poetry, and then we mail it back to our member. And it's really wonderful for building community for the volunteers, because while they're sitting around at a table reading the poems about all the issues that our members are going through, they're becoming educated, aware, and they're sharing ideas to, you know, brainstorm solutions to the root causes of incarceration. We found that community building super effective in the sense it was like, can you help us provide a lifeline to a young man in prison and encourage them in their poetry? But what really comes out of it is you're building a group of movement that is changing the mindset and the mentality around incarceration.
Thank you, Tara. And as a person who has been to a Write Night, it makes such a big impact, really, for the folks, you know, for the young people who are on the inside still, and then for the folks in the community who are trying to, you know, provide service and to really connect and to let them know that, you know, they're not alone and that we're waiting for them to return. So it looks like we have completed with our questions here. And so I think this would be a really great time for us to wrap up the call so I don't keep all of you for too long. You know, thank you to our presenters and to my co-host. This has been a really great dialogue. You know, just so you all know, after this webinar, we're going to make sure to send all of our attendees the materials that were mentioned today. For folks mentioned reports and websites, and so we want to make sure we get that to everyone. Right now, up on the slide, we have the email addresses for our presenters. So please feel free to jot that down so you can connect with everybody. We'll make sure to include that as well in our follow-up message. And really just, you know, Gabriela, thank you so much. We'll make sure to include your contact information as well. I would definitely recommend to those of you on the call who are interested in strategizing around how to engage young people and how to engage families. You know, Voices for Racial Justice, they're a model really for that kind of work. So I would recommend folks connect. Just a few logistics. The recording of the webinar will be available on our website in the next few weeks. One quick note for everybody is once you log off, you will receive a short survey in your browser window so that you can evaluate the webinar. We really do hope that you take a minute to fill it out. Let us know what you thought about the webinar and how we can improve. The feedback is always welcome. And finally, we just want to make sure that you tune in to our next Media Justice Salon, which will be launching right back up in the new year in January. You know, for those of you who are on the phone who are members, Media Justice Salons are just one of the many benefits of Magnet membership. We know we have a lot of really great allies with us today. So if you haven't already done so, you know, feel free to reach out to us. We have a lot of great things happening in the new year. In the spring, we will be running more skills building kinds of webinars. We'll be hosting a membership gathering in Detroit in the summer. And then throughout the year, we're going to continue to provide our press, campaign, leadership, and strategy support to all of our members. So for those of you who want to learn more, please make sure to reach out. For those of you who are in the process of renewing your membership, I highly recommend you fill out your membership form today. And then finally, we hope that you'll keep us all in mind for your end-of-year giving. Magnet is a grassroots-powered organization that relies on the contributions of our friends in order for us to build power and to win victories. So please consider making a donation on our Magnet website. You can find us at mag-net.org. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.